Hello, thank you so much for joining us for today's London Java community event with Edward. Let me introduce myself. First of all, my name is Abby and I work with Barry Cranford, who is the founder of the LJC, and I have the privilege of hosting today's event. For those of you who don't know, the LJC is just one of the currently 15, I believe, communities that is run by RecWorks. We are a tech recruitment company with a really big difference. So as a recruitment company, we're always on the lookout for more clients. Some of our best clients have come from community members who have recommended us to their internal team, talent team. So if you're hiring for a new team or you're working for a company that is, please do let us know. And if you want to know more about what we can offer, ping me a message on Twitter, LinkedIn or Slack. We really look forward to working with you. As a company, we believe that recruitment really can be a force for good in the industry beyond just placing people in jobs. We have a particular focus on learning, mentoring, and personal development. That's our huge difference. If people want to learn and others want to teach or share their knowledge, we are more than happy to connect you through our communities and events. We see this as giving back to those we've worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. To date, we have run hundreds of events for engineers and developers, students, graduates, CTOs. We have run conferences, lightning talks, hackathons, all sorts. Earlier this year, we made our 4,000th introduction through our Meet a Mentor program. We're really excited about that, and we're really looking forward to making 5,000 introductions through there. As I've already said, we love to give opportunities for people to connect, and this event is part of that. If you'd like to know more about any of our communities, you can find me on LinkedIn, get in touch with me. My name is as it appears on the screen for you, or Helen Lewis or Barry if you know him as well, and we can take it from there. The recording of today's session will be available on YouTube, and I will put the link in the chat channel as we go through the event today. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat as we go along. There will be some pause points where potentially you can unmute to ask a question if you'd like as well. So with no further ado, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Edward has to bring to us this evening. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Abby. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Edward, also known as the Archangel of Chaos. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm excited to share with you my story around adopting Next.js. So firstly, a little bit about my background. I've been using React and Angular since 2017, and I started using Next.js in 2021. In my career, I've adopted many new technologies. I delivered UIs using Angular 1.6, Varden, Adobe Flex, and even C# WinForms. So lots of experience in adopting new technology. So to set the scene for our story, I work at Analytics, and in June of 2020, we started building InfraLogic, a data platform for investing in wind farms, roads, hospitals, and other key pieces of infrastructure around the world. Yes, that's right, real infrastructure, not just fluffy clouds. In September of 2021, we converted InfraLogic over to Next.js. This talk is about my journey so far with adopting Next.js, problems I've encountered, and the solutions that I'm applying. So what am I going to cover? I'm going to start with why. Why bother with any new technology, let alone Next.js? Why I originally didn't want to adopt Next.js, and why eventually we took the plunge. And once we're done with the why, I'll talk about how we took an iterative approach to adopting Next.js, which focused on taking small steps whilst maintaining working software along the way. With the why and the how, we'll go through step by step the journey. Unsurprisingly, we'll start with how it started, our React UI and best friends forever architecture. So after we defined the backend for front-end architecture, I'll be going over its iterative transformations. Now we'll have time during the talk, as Abby mentioned, for questions. So if at any point, you feel shy, jot them down or just reach out. And for me, it'll be invaluable to have questions like, Edward, oh boy, you didn't explain server-side rendering very well. Could you run that by me one more time? So please ask me anything. Right at the end of the talk, for anyone who's left, I would humbly request you submit some feedback via the perfection game. And if you don't know what it is, stay tuned to find out. All right, let's go. So why bother adopting any technology and having to learn new stuff? Personally, I feel the answer has to be to solve a business problem. This problem then acts as a reference to how the technology can be objectively helping you to solve that problem. For instance, in this picture, how might we judge if the cube or the cylinder is better? Well, it depends on the problem. The problem might be stacking blocks, or the problem might be moving blocks around quickly. The point is, context matters. How valuable a technology is will depend on the context it's used in. So once we know the problem, I can then optimize my tech choices based on two things. One, reduce friction, or two, increase velocity. Now, let's agree on what these important words mean. I think of friction as the effort it takes to actually get started. Also, friction was keeps slowing me down. Easy example is React Router. It's a pain to plumb in. Maintaining it is not something that fills me with joy. It's something that slows me down and distracts from solving real business problems. Now, velocity, how do I define this? Well, if I think of solving a big business problem as answering a series of questions, then how fast I answer those questions is my velocity. The fastest way I know of answering any question is by using existing answer. So yes, just copy and paste from Stack Overflow. But seriously, the question of, will this technology speed me up is akin to, does this technology give me a bunch of answers to questions I have? Good example of this. If your application needs an API to help you read and write data, then the Next.js built-in API is great for this. So to summarize, to decide on adopting Next.js or indeed any technology, like one, identify the problem, like the destination, where I want to go to. Two, look at what's slowing me down from getting to that destination. For instance, kind of any missing or annoying parts of React development. And three, find the things that could speed me up, like problems that Next.js would solve for me out of the box. Now, if the stars align and I have all this information, then I'm potentially in a good place to adopt Next.js, right? Right? Well, timing is important. In my experience, there are wrong times to adopt any new technology. If you're surrounded by fire, don't start adopting new technology. It's definitely not fine. In 2020, when we started InfoLogic, it was a wrong time for me to adopt Next.js. Luckily, I was only dealing with metaphorical fires. But again, the reasoning comes back to friction and velocity. Friction-wise, we had more important sources of friction to resolve first. Analytics is a combination of many different companies, and the InfoLogic team was completely new, made up of individuals spanning like 5 or 6 different companies. Most of us were also learning a completely new business domain for the first time as well. Well, sure, that's the friction side, but what about the potential velocity benefits of Next? In my experience, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Adopting new technology comes with an opportunity cost. Now, we had zero Next.js experience in the team at the time, like some in the wider company. And as a result of that, the opportunity cost of adopting would have been way too high for us. The final nail in the coffin was that we had effectively already spent our innovation token on everyone learning TypeScript. Ergo, Next was a leap bit too far at the time. But then you ask, like, why am I giving this talk? Well, what changed? Well, in September 2021, what inspired us to explore the strange new world of Next.js? At this point, we'd been through the forming and storming cycle of our team, and we had a much better grasp of the business domain. In September 2021, the problems we were facing was balancing maintaining InfoLogic and other existing applications whilst also expanding to develop new applications. So to support this, it comes back to a need to like reduce friction with people working across the different applications, whilst also speeding up our development process on new applications. For the friction aspect, an obvious thing for us to do was ensure that all our apps were on the same tech stack. So if everyone knows that stack, then everyone can in theory work on everything. This is kind of a concept of like staff liquidity. So again, that's like reduce friction by standardizing technology. However, that doesn't necessarily mean Next.js. Like members of the audience might ask, like, oh, what about some Java framework? Or like, what about Nuxt or Svelte or anything else on the market? To answer that question, we need to look at two things which are very closely linked. One, the business goal of accelerating application development, and two, the skill sets of the wider team and the company. Now, my expertise and expertise on most of the company was in React. React is feature rich, and we have lots of experience in building very slick user experiences in it. So changing the underlying framework to like Vue or Svelte or Angular or anything else was a bit of a non-starter. There would need to be a lot of upside to justify throwing away all of our React expertise. From a velocity point of view, like Next.js made a lot of sense as an evolution of React. Next has a really large community around it, and Next also has a lot of solved technical problems, such as routing, which we could benefit from. All right, I've talked a lot about the whys, and if there's any questions, please do like either like jot them down or like ask them now. But next topic is to talk about hows. Not seeing any questions for the time being, so I'll move on. Cool.
No, I don't think we've got any yet, so.
No worries. All right, hows. Iterative versus incremental delivery. Now, this is a really powerful concept in software, and I absolutely love this image from Henrik for explaining it. I want to go over this with you and show how it applied to adopting Next.js. Right, so let's set the context and agree on what important words mean. In this picture, what we want is to get our user from A to B. We're transporting them. Now, we know our user would be happy taking a car. That would be their ideal state. And along the top, you can see an incremental delivery approach to that. So incremental meaning like we just start putting the car together, right? And this is our progress like week to week. Now notice that we don't have a functional product until week 4. And our user's not happy until week 4. So let's review like the bottom row where we take an iterative approach. The ethos here is building a working solution at every stage and delivering value at every stage. Now, week 1, the user might not be happy, but we have something usable that we can start. They can start using it, and then we can start learning about it. And bit by bit, after each new iteration, it's an evolution, but not a costly revolution. And if there's one image I want you all to take away from this talk, it's this. Now, how does this apply to Next.js? Imagine the first approach is to completely rewrite whatever UI you have, throw it all away, and start from scratch in Next.js. Now, I predict your users are going to have a bad time. They're going to be waiting around a long time. So what about the second approach? Is it possible to iteratively evolve a React UI to Next.js? Spoilers, yes. That's the approach that I'll cover with you all now. How to start with your skateboard and level it up bit by bit, all the while maintaining working software in production. Good times. All right, so let's start with how InfoLogic started off, and we're finally defining a BFF. So talking about a BFF architecture, many thanks to Vidandi for this diagram. Now the context, the business problem is we've got a bunch of services and data that we want to integrate to our UI. The diagram highlights one such architecture for solving that. This is the e-commerce domain, but it's a very common pattern. We have either services or microservices that we depend upon. And rather than having to integrate all these services in our UI layer, we want to abstract all of that together in this back-end called a front end. And this gives a nice segregation of responsibilities. The UI focuses on the look and feel, while the BFF focuses on the validation and transformation of data. In essence, the BFF handles all the nitty-gritty for the UI. Now, for the purposes of this diagram, I'm going to simplify it down a little bit and kind of focus on what's important. For InfoLogic and iAnalytics, our architecture boils down to this. Now, we have our backend for front-end servers, and they were running Node.js and Express. And within them, we have these API routes, and these are akin to like what you saw in the BFF. They're used by the UI to interact with our external services. Now, back then, we had what's called like a React single page application, SPA. Now, as I said, rather than rewriting this on Next, we migrated it iteratively to Next.js. And the first step is really simple. It's just simply lifting and shifting this SPA to Next.js. So we're going to keep this architecture all the same, except for that lifting and shifting. Now let's look at how we started with that. All right, we're diving into code. To everyone who doesn't like IntelliJ dark mode, my sympathies. This is looking at how we configure the application from the very top level. And let's talk through the steps here, right? So as I mentioned, we have Express running, and we're about to plumb in Next. So what we do is we spin up a Next application, and we also spin up the Express application as it was before. Now, the Express was acting as our BFF, and hence it had a whole bunch of API routes, which it did define, and we're not changing them right now. But the Express app is kind of serving all those API routes. The little shim that we're putting in now is this Next.js handler. So we've got this request handler, and the Express app is now sending all the traffic to Next app, and that lets us start serving our application for Next.js. And the final call is just the kind of the thing that actually makes Next.js go like the prepare call. So in essence, what we're adding is kind of spin up the app, create a request handler, send the traffic there, and start it up. That's it, almost. Very simple from the high level. So great stuff. So we just talked about the high level of hooking up Next.js. But so what's left in terms of like lifting and shifting our beautiful React UI to the paradise falls that is Next.js land? Well, there's a bunch of like basic but annoying tasks which I can't characterize as handle turning. I'm going to cover them from very high level, and I'm going to be touching upon concepts which are very common to like the create React app architecture. So let's get started. So first thing, bootstrapping. This is a very typical index.js file within a React application. It bootstraps React and other JavaScript libraries. Now, what you can see here is that you create React DOM, you have your application code, and like here we've got React Google Analytics. As I said, initialize other libraries, but also you have this kind of render call, which is very typical, right? You render your app into a div. Now, all of this React bootstrapping, it just goes away with Next.js. It handles it for you. The external libraries like Google Analytics, you still have to do it yourself, and you do that in what's called an _app.js file. Now, this is just one example, like handle turning. And rather than go through all the tasks in depth like this, then what we're going to do is look at a quick summary. So this is a list of remaining tasks, and if you want to ask me about the details right at the end or right now, like feel free. But just to highlight, along with not needing that index.js file which we just saw, we no longer need this kind of base index HTML file. That root div which you saw in the previous slide, which was index HTML, you don't need that anymore. If you had anything else important in this file, now, and typically what it goes to now is in this kind of _document.js file. Now, all of this, which I'm covering, is really, really, really well covered in the Next.js documentation. If you don't know about it already and you're thinking of like picking up Next.js, highly recommend you give it a read. All right. So this is kind of like the lifting and shifting stage. So where's this like kind of left us? If you assuming you've gone through all these handle tying tasks. Where we're at is we've boldly taken a step forward into the new frontier, albeit a relatively simple one. Like Next.js is now running our SPA, our React single page application. Now, functionally, the app behaves exactly the same. Note that the step is like really quite small and can be done really quickly. All that handle turning work took a few days to crack, and that's from a cold start. The emphasis being is that this is to simply make a start and to start getting exposure to Next.js. It's really very simple and very quick to have that first iterative step. All right. So we lifted and shifted. Now onto the next step of next adoption, and that is let's talk about the APIs. APIs. What am I going to cover here? Two things. I'm going to talk about the API that comes packaged with Next.js, and it's really quite easy to learn. Then I'm going to talk about our testing strategy and testing strategy for APIs. And please pay attention. If you know a better way of doing this, I want to hear from you at the end. So Next.js comes packaged with an API, and it will allow you to do all the work of a traditional BFF. Now, here's a screenshot lifted pretty much from the Next.js documentation, outlining what an endpoint to fetch a blog post might look like, okay? So it has a very specific folder structure. Like all the API endpoints live under this pages API directory, right? And what we're looking at is a dynamic endpoint on to get a specific blog post or PID. And that's the last part of the API URL. And in this, sorry, my headset off. And in this PID file, we can define access to the query object, which will have that actual post ID. Now here it just does a simple like a return statement, but you can imagine that there will be logic here to either read the blog post from a CMS or database of some sort. And if you look at it, take a step back, it's like really quite easy to use. You have a well-defined folder structure, and then you have a well-defined function that you define and give you what you need. Now, my best advice here, and you hear this from me a lot, is just like go read the Next.js documentations on the APIs. They're fantastic, really easy to comprehend. And if you have a good grip of it, like you'll be up and running with your Next.js app in no time. All right. Now, I don't know if we have some TDD enthusiasts in the crowd, but you might be, if you are, you might be screaming like, oh, how do you test this? Well, let's get on to that. This is a load of stripped down code on how we test drive API development with Next.js. I assume everyone is furiously digesting it all, so I'll give you all a second. All good. All right. I'm going to walk us through it. Now, remember, bonus points if you can tell me a better way of doing this at the end. The core library, the core library that we use here is called supertest. And we've got this test client method, which is effectively a test bench or wrapper that lets us poke at one of our one of our Next.js handlers, which you saw in the previous slide. Now, the eagle-eyed of you will see this terrible hack in that we're breaking into the internals of Next.dist to get access to the API resolver. Now, the trade of this brittleness is that we're actually testing how our API behaves, like how it actually runs. That's our harness. Well, let's talk about what a test actually looks like. We're going to take a handler, the same as we saw before, for the blog post with the PID, and we import it. And then we're going to wrap that handler with our test client. And then you get to make like HTTP calls as you would normally and then you get to check the results. Now, in this very basic example, we're going to pretend that this blog post was eaten by the devil and hence would always return a 404. But you might ask, like, why go to all this trouble? Like, well, what this test client allows us to do is to rapidly like unit test the API. and it gives us all the happiness that comes with like test-driven development. Like this method makes it straightforward to migrate any Express API endpoint to Next.js, but bit by bit. So what does that look like in practice? Kind of, we define a test for Next.js handler using this test client. We port over a slice of the logic to implement that handler. And then we kind of red, green refactor. We'll keep going until like the entire API functionality is ported over. Now, if you could, if you know a better way of doing this, like please let me know. And because any kind of burning questions at this point, like feel free to ask as well. Otherwise, I'll move on. Grand. All right, fantastic. At this point of the adoption, we've got our single page application running inside of Next.js, all of it now. We have our API endpoints, all using Next, and the code that we had in our BFF serving the API using Express, that's all gone now. It's all been refactored away. Again, there's no visible user changes, and we still have a fully functioning app. So step 2 of 4, API, all done, woohoo, we're halfway there. The next step in our epic quest into the unknown is refactoring the single page application. So let's take a look at how we get there. Alrighty. So let's cover how we're going to bury React Router and never speak about all the pain and suffering it's caused us ever again. But seriously, Next.js has an inbuilt router, and it is a joy to work with. I'm going to give you a very brief overview. Then I'm going to talk about how basically I don't worry about testing it too much. So to begin, what we're looking at is again lifted directly from Next.js docs. And what you see is that as with before, Next uses the pages folder to define pages. And here you can see a basic about page. And it's really easy to use. You just basically define your React component and then return it. And similarly, you can have a file for each page that you want to serve. For instance, this contact file might have an email address in it, and that's it. I find the best way to think about like the React route, the Next router is purely as entry points. Like if this about function was any more complicated, I would separate it into a separate class. And then you would like kind of develop and test it as you would normally. Speaking of which, like testing. For testing React Next routing, I do it as little as I can, but no less. So what does that mean? Well, given that there's so little code to configure inside of like there's so little code to configure, like if I'm doing more testing, I'm effectively just testing the library. So I don't bother. I don't test the routing directly. Instead, what I do here, you can see here, is like write end-to-end tests, right? Which may depend on the routing, but not necessarily checking the routing directly. For instance, here I have a test where the user lands on the home page, they're clicking on help, and then they're just shown a support email. Like navigating to like /help might be like explicitly part of the steps, but it's just being implicitly tested in this kind of workflow. There's no like explicit mention of it. Now, there's a plethora of end-to-end tools that you could use. So long as you're not using Selenium, you're probably good. He's dead now, right? Right. We are using Cypress, and I think it works well. It's got an auto recording feature, so like when tests fail, you get screenshots and videos of it. Now, for the purists out there, if you want to do more unit testing, I personally wouldn't go beyond just checking that you've set the right href property on the link. Like I've not attempted to wrap the Next router with a test harness, as you might have saw previously, and I don't think it's worth it. But to recap, like we've harnessed the power of Next.js API, and now we're like covered the Next.js like routing as well. And what this gives us is removing the friction like I've typically encountered with setting up and maintaining like routing code and dependencies. And overall, I'm happy with how it speeds up the projects and all around it's a very good developer experience. All right, so at this point, what's left in the Next.js bag of tricks? A new challenger approaches. Awesome beans. We've covered like Next.js pages, refactoring away the single page application into multiple pages. And now we can talk about rendering those pages. So I'm going to cover client-side rendering, i.e. vanilla React, versus server-side rendering, also known as dynamic rendering. So firstly, why is this important? The context I'm talking about is the problem of rendering a page, dynamic pieces of data, for instance, a blog post with widgets customized to the user. How fast that page appears on the screen affects how fast the page feels to the user. It's a subjective measure of the quality of the page. And in our scenario, time is money. And we always want to add that premium product feeling by making things seem instantaneous. So within that context, I'll go over 1, what is CSR? 2, what is SSR and how it feels faster? 3, how to actually do server-side rendering in Next.js. And 4, finally, I've got a little gotcha for you for SSR, and a hint for later is like you have no client on the server side, so keep that in mind. All right, let's go. Client-side rendering. Like, massive thank you to Monica for this flow diagram. From left to right, you can see what happens when a user first visits a client-side rendered site. And along the bottom is what the user sees. Along the top is what's happening behind the scenes. Now, initially, the user hits our server and it returns an index HTML, the raw HTML. Now, inside of that HTML, there'll be references to JavaScript files, which then need to be downloaded to the user's client. And usually they go back to your server for it. Once the browser has downloaded the JavaScript, and this will include libraries like React, it will start executing that JavaScript. And this is where the pretty colors start appearing on screen. Only once all that has happened does the blank screen go away and the whole page is now visible and also can be clicked on. The core point here is with client-side rendering, the user has some amount waiting time for things to appear on the screen. And this is what we call the initial time to render problem. So how do we solve that? Well, server-side rendering, and again, a massive thank you to Monica. It's the same setup as before. Let's review it and highlight the differences. So again, initially the user hits your server, but this time the server has rendered more than just HTML. There's actually content there as well. So in the second step, the browser can now display something meaningful to the user. You know, they have actually something on the screen. Now, it still has to go through getting the JavaScript to make the page interactable. So steps 2, 3, and 4 are effectively the same. Now, here's what I was getting at in regards to the user feeling that the page is faster. In this setup, the only thing that's faster is the page is visible faster at step 2. We've optimized our initial time to render. Now, the user will still have to wait until right at the end for them to be able to click and interact with the screen. Now, typically, and your mileage may vary, the user doesn't click on the page until it's interactable anyway, like assuming that you get to interactability within the order of 100 milliseconds or so. Making the page appear on the screen within 100 milliseconds, though, will make the site appear as instantaneous to the user, and the citation needed go to Google for the research. What's important is that kind of this level of low latency is not something I'd worry about, like definitely not at first, at least. My ethos is to get the product working right before you get it working quickly. But given that with Next.js, we've just nailed down all the other things I've talked about, it's fantastic that it kind of just gives you this ability to do this kind of optimization, like right out of the box. So grand, like we talked about this all in theory. So let's actually review how we actually do server-side rendering with Next.js. All right, what are we looking at here? It's code to help server-side render our blog page. This get server-side props method is the heart of server-side rendering in Next.js. So take a moment, breathe it in. Okay, grand. You all know, right? You all know right now. Yeah, I'll move on. I'm just kidding. Let's actually walk through what's going on here. So number one, this method lives inside your Next.js page, like the actual kind of about page you saw earlier, and it's called when your page is first requested, and it's designed to return the initial properties that the page needs. So all the data it needs. In this case, blog page or blog post. Now there's a bunch of edge cases that I've highlighted here that we should be aware of. Now this comment highlights that in Next.js, you need to start thinking about authentication on every page. Remember, it's no more single page application. Can't rely on a top level app auth component to deal with audio authentication. So what, assuming we're authenticated, what does this method give us? Well, we have the context and the parameters for the user's request. And you remember, like before, we're asking about a blog post with a PID, right? So here, what we can do is extract the PID, and then we can call our own service to fetch the data. And yes, this is very much a job that traditionally a BFF would be doing. And the whole kind of like validating this as a valid post, fetching it, and then transforming it and returning it into the UI. Now, why is all this useful? Well, it goes beyond just rendering HTML and sending it back to the client, right? This is actually sending back the actual data we need. So you make the call to server and boom, like everything you need to show to the user is just there, one hop, one round trip. Notice that we're not really done much black magic here. That Next even labels this kind of feature as a basic feature. And by adopting Next.js, you kind of like get access to this, and you're able to develop faster by using the features it has to solve a bunch of problems that we want to solve, such as the initial rendering delay. But hey, no free lunches, right? So what are the pitfalls? What are the gotchas here with server-side rendering? Well, here's a nice gotcha for you. Say you've got a component that wants to read the user's browser cookies, or you want to access the local storage, or you want to measure the client's browser width, or some sort of interactive user agent. Like, can you guess how many of these things are available on the server side? Yeah, that's right. Nothing, zero. So you need to actually do client-side rendering to get access to those things. Now, what you see here is a very Stack Overflow-esque solution to kind of prevent server-side rendering that we use. It's not pretty, but it does the job. So what's going on here? Let's take a look. So we've got this kind of mounted Boolean that is part of state, and we only set it to true once this use effect hook has run. And this use effect hook will only run on the client side. Ergo, this will only be true once the component is server side is being client side rendered, and hence we force the component to be client side rendered. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, ask me questions at the end if this isn't clear. Grand. Let's start wrapping up. So where is the architecture at now? The brave new world of Next.js. It's a single application and code base. We've got our API and our lightning fast pages, which may or may not be server-side rendered. So how do we get here? To recap, in iAnalytics, we migrated our flagship InfoLogic project to Next.js starting in September 2021. This was with the goal of standardizing our technology stack and speeding up our application development across the company. Rather than taking a big bang approach, a big rewrite approach, we underwent an iterative transformation of our React UI and best friends forever architecture. We first lifted our shiny React UI and transplanted it as is to Next.js. Then we migrated our API to Next. Then we split our SPA into Next pages. And last but not least, we started leveraging the server-side rendering to help improve the slick, responsive feel of our UI. All right, grand. To those who are still awake, thank you so much. Here's a screenshot of InfoLogic for you. It's my baby. Like, feel free to ask me anything about it at all. And indeed, if you have any questions, now is the time.
Fantastic. I know I've heard that talk before, but it's always fascinating to hear you speak and share what you know. It's great. I love it. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Edward?
I know some people joined in late, so there are no silly questions. I'm happy to go back.
I will take that as a no. You must have been entirely comprehensive, which I'm sure you were anyway, but it's good to know. Edward, are you happy just to put your contact info up in case anyone does think of something later that they want to ask?
Yeah, of course, yes. Very much why I asked the perfection game as promised. Kind of rate this talk even now or like in at your own leisure, like out of 10. Kind of speak about what you want to enjoy. Like for instance, like I was a 7 out of 10. Like I really enjoyed like the explaining the server-side rendering, but like to make it a 10 out of 10, I need more cat pictures. Just kind of anything to your heart's desire. You can reach me via email or like on Slack. I'm on LJC Slack as well as Endgineers London, and you can reach me on Twitter on that handle.
Excellent. And I have sent all of you the link for the YouTube channel, so if you want to watch this video back at any later date, you can do. Give it about a week for it to be on the YouTube channel, and then it'll be there ready for you to be able to watch again. So all that is left for me to say now is thank you, Edward, so much for coming and sharing what you know. It's always great to hear from you, so thank you for your time and effort. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.